Pojagi patchwork is an ancient Korean textile technique that is used to make pojagi or wrapping cloths. It's traditionally done with silk thread and silk fabric like you can see in this piece. And the one thing that is distinctive about it is the stitching is visible. You can clearly see it. It's done in a contrasting color. And so it is actually part of the design. It is not merely functional. Silk fabric and thread can be difficult to find in North America. So I'm going to show you how to do this same technique with something more readily available, linen fabric and pearl cotton. But it's the exact same technique no matter what materials you're using. So this technique does use templates, cardboard templates. You'll also need your fabric, your thread, a needle. Since I'm using linen, I'm going to use like a cross stitch needle or a crewel needle, a large eye and a dull tip. If you are using silk fabric, you would want a point tip needle and a much smaller, narrower needle. You'll need scissors. The other really important thing you'll need is a hair marker. These are available in plastic. I think you can get traditional ones made out of bone or wood or ivory. Plastic ones work fine. And you may not have used this before in stitching, but once you use it, you might find a lot of other ideas of ways that you can use it. So the first thing we're going to do is mark our pieces. So the templates that we have are the actual size of the finished piece that we want. So there are no seam allowances. So when we're going to mark it on the fabric, you need to make sure that there is space around the edge for the seam allowance. And then you're going to press and with the back and forth motion, pressing quite firmly, go all the way around that piece. And you can see that the creases are marked right into the fabric. You can clearly see that piece. Now I'm going to do the next one. So in this one, remember to leave space for 2 seam allowances because we're going to cut in between. You want the seam allowance for this one and the seam allowance for this one. So don't put it too close. You can always trim the seam allowances down after you've stitched it. So there we have our 2 pieces. So I'm going to cut them out now. And try and leave about 1/4 inch seam allowance, but it doesn't have to be exact because we don't use the seam allowances to measure anything. So once you've done that, go around and finger press all the creases just to help set them into the fabric. Then we're going to take the pieces and pin them together. So the way we pin them together, fold down the seam allowance and then fold down the seam allowance of the other seam that you're going to stitch together. We're going to take a pin and we're finding this line here that we can see from the crease and the other line and pin together at that point. Now match the other crease and it should line up. So here we have our 2 pieces to go together. So to stitch, we'll thread our needle and then knot the thread with a small knot. And you can see our pieces are pinned together, right sides out, and our seam allowances are both folded to the inside. So you can see them there. Now I'm going to move this pin over because this is where we're going to start stitching. We're not going to stitch in the seam allowance. We're going to start right at the edge of that piece. So I'm going to put my needle in and come out right at that corner. And my knot stays buried inside the seam allowance. Now I'm going to take an overcast stitch right between the two pieces. And I'm going to continue along the seam. Now don't pull these stitches too tightly because we're going to want this to open flat. We also want to have our stitches just up at the top, so you're only getting a couple of threads, but make sure it does go clearly through all the pieces. So once you get to the end, and remember we're not going to the very end through the seam allowances, we're going to stop at this crease mark. Just take another tiny stitch and then check before you cut off your thread. This should lay flat. There shouldn't be any holes in it, and it shouldn't be pulled up so like this, like a little mountain, so it can't lay flat. It should lay flat and smooth, and your stitches should be fairly consistent in size. So this is fine. So I'm going to take the needle to the back side, and now I'm just going to put a knot in the seam allowance. And then trim off the thread. Now, if you're doing a really small project, you might want to trim your seam allowances depending on the fabric. With linen, you don't want to trim them too small. Keep them at about 1/4 inch. So this seam is used in pieces that are lined. So it will either be quilted or will have some kind of backing. So we don't need to worry about the seam allowances, the raw edges on the back. And it's a simple seam. It's not a difficult stitch to do. It takes a little bit of practice to get the tension right and to get the stitches consistent. But once you do that, you won't have any problems. I hope you have fun with this and you can try out your own fun projects with it. If you want any ideas or more tutorials, you can check out epidastudio.com.